Hello and welcome back to Factorial. My name is ABuckNasty. In today's exciting episode, we are going to be exploring the different types of ways that you can transfer an item from one chest to another chest. So this is kind of the concept of like daisy chaining inserters and getting from one place to another if you're not using belts. So this is like traditionally you'd want to go and use direct insertion as much as possible to bring one item from one assembly machine into another. But in some cases, you can't quite do that because you need a little bit more space or to cover a larger gap because you either need to include more beacons or you need more you're trying to compactly get as many buildings as close to each other. And the ratios of the amount of beacons you can get around a building isn't going to always quite line up the way that you want to. So in some cases, you're going to want these different types of configurations, and you're going to want, in what I want to explore in today's video, is as deep of a dive as I possibly can into the different types of chests. Like, do wooden chests matter? Does it matter if you limit the amount of slots that they have? And then for the buildings that actually support it, like a cargo wagon, for example, can be limited or it can be filtered. Does filtering matter? Is filtering better? Is filtering worse? Is it better to filter on the first slot or the last slot? Does order matter as well on the filters? Because you can also use cars for this, for example, to go and daisy chain items. Cars, for example, have the unique ability to have all kinds of really nice configurations. So for example, over here, we can do things that you wouldn't normally be able to do with these types of inserter chaining, because you can cover in one sense, a much longer distance, but only have 2 inserters compared to over here on the left-hand side, you have 3, like an extra inserter. So the question is kind of like, if, and this is a big caveat, I'm testing everything with either cars are enabled, or I'm going to have it so that cars are disabled. So you can see I just ran that command there. That command is going to disable all the cars and all the tanks in the map, and they show up with that little disabled by script. You can also do this also for silos, by the way, which I just recently discovered, which is an interesting thing. But in general, what I'm trying to explore is the concept of very focused for this. Cars, tanks, trains, cargo wagons, and which of these are going to be the best for transferring items across a variety of different scales. So we're going to have the case here where we're going to be transferring items over 7 tiles. We're going to have the traditional 5 tile test like this here, where we just have like 5 that are going across. And then of course for cargo wagons, the big difference is that you can go a total distance of 9 tiles. Now, I'm calling this 9 tiles because the reason being, if you wound up actually chaining inserters this way, you can't quite get to the 10th slot, even though you can do that. So for simplicity's sake, I'm going to be considering this equivalent to this setup here on the top. And the reason being because you can easily just slide them right underneath the cargo wagon, and you can have that kind of a configuration to get a total of, in this case here, 9 tiles. So the reason I'm exploring this, I will cover here in a second, but I wanted to first give an intro of what different types of chests we are going to be exploring. And next here, I'll give you the reasoning for why I'm interested in this. So the reason that I've hyperfixated on this particular problem is that I've seen a couple of emerging trends that have come up, and specifically in the purple science competition that we're doing right now. One of the big things is around actually going and smelting stone into stone bricks. And the reason being because there is a sweet spot, which is at 11 beacons for an electric furnace. You're going to get to the point where you can get over the sacred 50 per second production of stone bricks. Why is that important? Well, because for every 120 science that you need for purple science, so I'll explain this here. If you look at the ratios here, you're going to need 1 electric furnace for 3 production science packs, right? So if we took this and we said, okay, let me grab my calculator out. Let's say we have, I want to make per side, like I want to make 120 science per minute. And I'm going to say here, I'll divide this in this case by 3. So that means I would need 40 furnaces. Now, because of productivity being 2 times or 2x, so 100%, we're only going to need 20 per second. So this ratio is really nice. It means in even numbers, we would like to have 10 or 20 So, and ideally we'd like to have like what we can probably get max out of one assembly machine. Well, we can get about 10 per second. So that means we'd only need 2 of these configurations for every 120 science that we're producing per second. So where this gets a little bit more tricky is how do you get enough beacons around the actual furnace? So there's trade-offs that are made in order to actually make this happen. Because the moment that you remove 1 beacon, you get below the actual mount. So this can only produce 47.95 per second. But what we really want is we want this, so it's over the 50 per second. Well, why do we want 50 per second? Well, because this particular electric furnace here is going to be consuming 100 stone bricks. So you can, with direct insertion, you can just barely squeeze over the requirements to get this to exactly constantly be producing 10 per second. So this is the advantage that you have when you are belting stone, for example, is that you very conveniently have easily enough space to be able to go and get enough beacons around using a layout that's like this. You could slightly change the configuration, maybe make it more aesthetic, but that's the point, is that you can very easily do this without too much hassle. A lot of the designers have taken an interest in, okay, well, let's say we want to, like, and I'll highlight this here as the next point before I get into that. The problem here is that, okay, you could make a very quick optimization. You could say, well, I want to direct insert steel. Well, okay, now you get into the problem that I can't quite get 11 beacons around this and still do direct insertion. So the way that I have to do it is I have to start chaining items through a chest. So now this could get, of course, a lot better if you actually clock this build so that there's constant back pressure inside here. There's a lot of ways that we could improve this, but for the simple layout here, you're seeing now we're starting to already have to reach for grabbing a chest. So in that case, you're going, okay, so I'm doing this, but and this doesn't seem too bad. But the question that I saw a lot of designers then have when they made this decision is, okay, well, which chest type should I use? Should I use a wooden chest? Should I use a steel chest? Some people just, because they happen to be in the editor always having quality being legendary, they grabbed one of these. And then they would go and they'd filter this down all the way to basically just one slot. And so my question that I have kind of throughout this whole entire competition has been like, does this even matter? I know that there's been benchmarks that have been done in the past that showed clearly that a wooden chest is better, but I haven't talked about it myself because I have no basis to myself to say that this is good or bad. And so I want to go and test that myself because I don't want to just take a benchmark that was done years ago on an older version of Factorial. There's a lot of optimizations that have been made since then. Let's test it out now. Let's see if anything's different. And I'll say there's one extra case where this starts to get even more complicated. A lot of designers have opted for using electric mining drills to directly mine into one of these furnaces. And you can start to see the problem with the layout because this is a 3x3 item. Well, the beacons are the same way and they only operate on a 9x9 grid. So the moment that you try to go and grab an electric furnace and try to go, or not electric furnace, but an electric mining drill going into the furnace, you're not going to have enough space to do this. So you have to start making compromises. So a compromise that I created here as just a demo, and this is a very complicated demo, but ignore all the circuit logic that's happening. The point of what I'm trying to test out here is, okay, I can create a layout where I can fully get the 11 beacons around one of these stone bricks, but I'm now, instead of mining directly into the electric furnace, can we create a layout where we're now mining into a car? So the car is really convenient because of the spacing that it provides you. So I've created a couple of blueprint books here. So I created these specifically so that I could go and test out a couple different combinations. I wanted something, I created this with the script to generate all of these, but I have one in every single orientation for both cars here that you're seeing. And I also have it for tanks. So we can literally put it in any orientation that we want. And for fun, I use the compass indicators so that it's either north, northeast, north by northeast, etc. Just instead of just giving an angle, because I thought that was more fun. But you can see kind of like you can get some really interesting things going on with these cars by rotating them and abusing the hitbox pretty drastically here, right? So it's like an interesting thing that we can do. So it gives you the benefit that you can here, in this case, we can cover a 4-tile or even, what is this actually here? This from here to here, a 5-tile gap, and only have 2 inserters and having a direct insertion of this miner. And it only needs to run every once in a while, given the high mining productivity we have, to completely go and fill this entire chest by just running it for about 30 ticks or so every, like a minute or something like that, like you see here. Just quickly fills the chest and we're done. So the question that I had was then like, okay, we're using here now a lot of chaining to get enough that can be on patch, but maybe balance the best of both worlds. I'm not going to be testing this specific design today, but I wanted to give an example of why this is a question that I have and that I feel like has not been explored yet. And there's a lot of assumptions that are being made in a lot of these designs. And before I even go and review all the designs, I wanted a fundamental basis to be able to understand, is this superior or not? So that's the hypothesis, and all the items that we're going to test today is around the concept of using cars, tanks, different types of chests, and covering the different tile distances. So with that being said, I'm going to go now into the results of this. I'm going to show a couple of the different benchmark scenarios we have, and I'm going to go and review them and discuss the results with you. So first, I want to talk through a failed experiment that I did. Why am I showcasing this? I find it useful to learn from your mistakes. So sharing your mistakes are also, I think, useful so that other people can then maybe learn from them and not repeat the same mistakes. So initially, when I was trying to benchmark this, I was trying to create a very specific scenario that is shown over here on the left-hand side. I wanted a scenario where I am not using infinity chests, because infinity chests have an overhead of constantly updating their inventory and constantly putting items in. So I wanted to say I don't want infinity chests for this test. I want a very fixed amount with normal game items that you would place normally. So that presented its first problem for me, was that, okay, if I'm going to do this, let's say I wanted to put an infinity of, let's say, stone bricks in here, well, then I have a finite amount of items that I could transfer for this. And I'm also not being able to test this specific scenario where I'm going into one slot versus multiple slots, etc. So I said, okay, well, an item that exists in the game that I could use, so I don't even have to care about stack sizes, is specifically a coin. Coins have the very specific nice property that, well, you can't get them normally in the game, but they do exist in the vanilla game, and they can stack up to 100,000 items. So that's really convenient because I could put an absolute arbitrary amount of coins that I wanted in this initial slot, and it would always occupy the slot for a very long time. So that was a nice test. However, the mistake that I made is that I wanted to test this exact sequence. So I learned some things from it, so I'll explain what is kind of going on behind the scenes. But what I'll say is this: the way that the game was started is I created, effectively of this, there are up to 80,000 total inserters that were in the tests that were run here. And this was something that I worked on for a couple of days. I had a couple of different people help me out. But what the test did was we created a whole bunch of clones of this. And the idea was, okay, we're going to run this test and we're only going to sample a very small portion of this time. So I'll walk you through this. And here's the actual time series chart that explains what's happening at each one of these. So this is exactly the same setup that we have here, but that we have on the right. So what happens is the very first tick, we load the save and initialize power to all entities. That's omitted from this test. The very first tick, which I'll do by advancing the game one tick by pressing the period on my keyboard, that's when they pick up items. I didn't care about that because that's not what we're testing. We're testing about what happens with this inserter or going into this chest and out of it. So 0 and 1 are omitted. Ticks 2 and 3 here are going to be when the inserter is actually swinging. And then when we come down to we'll go here to the fourth tick. The fourth tick is when it's going to actually put the item into the chest. So at this point, that's where you see this large spike. Inventory transaction happens. This inserter is going to wake up. And we can see that here. If I go and let me activate the wake lists for this. So we have wake up lists. And then let me go and remove all the other things that are not helpful for this. And I will show then the active state as well. Cool. So you can see they're both right now active. And so at this point, this inserter picks up, and that's that fifth tick here. This one's picking up, and this one's swinging back. Ticks 6 and 7 is when both of these inserters are swinging. So you can see there's some update time associated with them both swinging, right? So then the 8th tick, well, what's happening? Why is there a spike? Well, because this inserter has to go and scan every single item in this chest to see, is there anything for me to pick up? So that has a cost associated with it, even though there's nothing in there. So it scans it, says I have nothing to do, cool, and then moves on. The next tick right after that point is going to be when the inserter actually drops an item into this chest. And you can see that has this amount of cost here associated with that. So it drops off the item. So you can see also that there's kind of almost like a double scale. So this is about 18,000 microseconds here. This is about 8,000, so relative scale here. What happens is the cost of the drop and the scan event both compound for two inserters, all the inserters having to do something. And then you can see here that once this drops, it's about half that, right? So then when we go to the next tick, well, these are just one inserter swinging. And so you can see kind of like this double scale. When both the inserters are swinging, it's twice that amount. And so then we can see that there's going to be like a few more ticks here until we get back. And then finally, there's this last tick here, the 13th tick, where it does another scan of that inventory. So the scan events are the expensive part that you can see here. The swings are relatively cheap by comparison, but it's about twice as costly to read from the chest than it is to actually be swinging. So eliminating these scans specifically is going to be good for UPS. Even if you go and you disable them via a control circuit or something like that, those are good things to do. So this hopefully explains the life cycle of an inserter, what it's doing at each point, where it's going to look at an individual chest, and how it's making decisions around that. So why did this test fail? Well, this test fails because And honestly, I gotta say thank you to Blousy, because Blousy did a fantastic job of actually going and running this on a relatively noise-free Linux machine that he has. And he ran this entire test here, and I'll explain this here. We had all of these tests that we have here on the right-hand side. So let me go and actually expand now this to a full screen so I can talk through it a little bit better. So in this particular scenario, all those little blue dots are all the runs. So with my original test, I was getting some relatively noisy data as is shown by the distribution here. And I was starting to have a really hard time comparing steel chests versus iron chests versus wooden chests. And I was just having a hard time just even like testing it out and getting like a decent result. So Blousy wound up actually running each of these saves 250 times. So combined between his runs and mine, we did over 9,000 runs for what you're seeing here. So this is a pretty cool data set, so I want to showcase it, even if it doesn't actually yield anything that's useful. So what I want to first kind of point out with this is if you look at the average hole update time across all of these different types of chests, so you're seeing here, this is a steel chest that is limited, that's a so this is legendary when we say Q5 here. This is a wooden chest that happens to be limited. But then the wooden chest over here is the best performer. But the problem with this that I'm seeing is that look at the number of runs that we have. Even on a almost virtually, there's nothing else running on this machine, right? So it's a box that's just running Arch Linux. It's got like an absolute like bare bones implementation. There's like nothing running on it other than Factorio. So it should be virtually as noise free as possible. And yet we're still having this large distribution between these different runs. And the reason why I would say like this is not enough to actually draw anything is that if you're looking at this, you'd say, well, okay, the wooden chest is going to be the best option. Well, why then, if you limit the slot, is it worse? That doesn't make any sense. And in fact, like old benchmarks from back in like the 0.16 days showed the opposite, that limiting it was better. So what I think is kind of going on is that you can't go and I can't reliably say this is a good benchmark, because your actual average or the quartile distribution, so this is your average here, and this is going to be, you know, your first and second quartile distributions all the way to like the very out, and then your outliers out here, right? So if you're looking at this, the problem that comes about is that the difference between these different runs and their averages, the relative difference between these different these different test setups are less than the standard distribution of runs. So that means that effectively, even though we do see what seems like an overall downward trend here, that the wooden chest would be the best, I can't confidently say that, because if I took, let's say, just to make this really like a good example here, if I said, okay, the wooden chest, because it performed on average, being slightly better here, if I looked at that and let's say I took the best run that's down here. Well, this best run, technically, there was another result from the steel chest that was just as good as the best run down here. So this is, again, the lower, the better. And you're seeing that very close second was iron chests. So it's like, that doesn't make any sense. That means that you could have a scenario where you had a really good run if you took just the minimum, and they're all really similar. The only thing that was common across all the tests we did is that a very large chest, like a steel chest that is legendary, is going to be slightly worse. That seemed like enough of an outlier for it to show up, but for the rest, it seems like there's almost no difference for this. So even though, like, unfortunately for me, I did a whole bunch of like actual investigation of this, and I ran a whole bunch of tests, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that's in here. I've thrown all this out, and I'm saying that this is not a valid way to test this. And so for that reason, I've come up with a whole new set of tests to try to investigate this better, and I'm going to go showcase those, and I'm now actually confident in those results. But I wanted to show this so that people can understand that, like, the way you test something and what you're testing, you're looking for things that are like, okay, this is obviously worse than this. There's no question about that. But down here, I can't tell a difference, even when you break it out into this way and do, in our case, 9,000 total runs to try to get this data. It's not enough of a difference for you to care, is what I'm saying. And it's not producing reliable results. So that's not going to be a good benchmark in the end. So anyway, let me go through the actual, like, the real tests that I did and highlight those. So the tests that I've now worked on and where I'm at now is I've created a whole new set of tests. These tests are different. Instead of us sampling a very small window of time, we're sampling a large period, about 8,000 ticks of transferring 16,000 items total. So we have different ones here. We can see iron, you can see wooden chests, you can see that there are a whole bunch of different scenarios. So I'll explain one of these here. So like I'll let me load up the like more traditional one here. So, or I guess not really traditional. So this is a case where you're using cars. So this is a benchmark that exists, and you can see here that there's a whole bunch of cars that are all set up here for this particular test. And what I'll do now is I'll actually show here in the debug menu the entity and time usage so that we can see this. So the way that this now works, this new test, is we have 16,000 total coins that are put in here. And we know that this is going to take 8,000 and change ticks to completely transfer all the items that are in there. And the way that you can very easily do that is you could say, well, I know it's going to take 8 ticks to get from here to here, 16,000 of those divided by 16 transfers each times 8 is going to be about 8,000 ticks, and then it needs to swing back, right? So about 8,010. So the way that this works is we ran this for 8,020 just so that we would completely finish everything. But I'll go ahead and run this at 8 times here so you can see it. So this would play, and this would be constantly running. We'd measure the update time in the benchmark, and then you would get here at the end, once this would go and completely finish, you would get to the point where this would stop, and we would get to the point where there are no items left in this chest. Now, I need to run this substantially faster to actually have this happen relatively quickly, but you get kind of the idea that this is the idea for now a benchmark, is that we run this for a very long period of time, constantly transferring items in and out of, in this case, here is a car that happens to have the very first slot filtered for the item that we have, but all the rest are blocked by a deconstruction planner to just indicate nothing is in it. So we're running this over and over again until we get to the point where this would stop. This is exactly 8,000 ticks later, 8,010 ticks later, and then we would save it. We ran this for 3 runs each, and I've created a whole bunch of different copies in different scenarios for this. So there's other tests that are included in this as well. There's going to be the case of using tanks, for example. So here's the case where we wind up using a tank. And again, in a different scenario where you happen to have the last slot is the one that actually happens to be free. There's other scenarios as well where a coin is the one that's actually filtered and then that's copied, etc. And the idea is to go and test this in as many cases as possible and go ahead and run this and see what the overall UPS is when we're doing this. So what you can see though here too that I want to point out right away is an interesting thing that's happening right now. Just to show this, the tanks themselves, and a really interesting thing is you could look at the electric network and update time. This is really high. This is like disproportionately high for these particular tests. And one thing that I discovered, even though we're disabling the tanks, my theory of what's going on is because they happen to have an equipment grid, looking at like the Lua API that exists for you to actually hook into this, there's a check that can be done on a tank, for example, or anything with an equipment grid to check if it happens to have enough power for its currently for it, right? So in essence, each tank is its own mini electric network. And so you start to see this large electric network update time just by tanks, even if you disable them via script. So then what you would kind of then look at is like, okay, if you don't use tanks, there's another example where we're using this. So here's an example with that same setup, but with cars instead. There's no filters here. We go ahead and run this. You've seen the electric network update time is like, you know, a tiny fraction of what it was, even though, and these are also disabled, or actually in this case, it's not disabled. I'm using that as an example. There's also one where I happen to run the script to go and disable them all, and there's another save for that. You can see the car completely drained in terms of their entity update time. But what I wanted to point out is like the very first discovery that we've made from this test is that tanks have an electric network update time cost to them just for literally existing, and there's nothing you can do about it to disable it. Okay, so now that you've seen the new testing setup, what it looks like and all those, let's go talk through the results. Okay, so the results that you're seeing here on the right-hand side is something that's available on my GitHub. So it'll be linked in the video description below. I always write a documented version of this so that anybody can refer to this in the future and you don't have to go and rewatch the video to remember what was said. Mainly, I do it for that reason, but also mainly because my brain cannot remember all these things, so I write things down so that I can just remember them myself. So for this, that's that explainer, the 8,020 ticks that were run in the 3 runs. I've explained all that already, so I'm not going to go over it again, but that's existing in this scenario. So if you see the term disabled, that means that I have disabled cars and tanks, and I've used this particular command to go and disable them. So if you go and you see here a term filtered, that represents this scenario where you have everything else is filtered for something that can be filtered, and the very first one is free. I will always say if the version here, and I'll show this here as the map, if it's filtered, I'm going to say the first is empty, and you'll see that here. And then in the case where it winds up having an actual item inside of it, I will say that it is filtered for that specific case like this. Or I'll say the first slot is a coin or whatever the material is that I happen to be transferring. So, and then otherwise, if it's supporting a limited case, that means that I'm going to use the limiting tool here to limit the amount of slots. In this case, I'm always going to limit it to just 1 slot. I'm not going to limit it to more than that, but I'm going to, so that's going to be quote unquote the best case scenario if limiting is better or not. So that's what I'm going to try to experiment with. Otherwise, if you don't see any labels on here, that means that it's just going to be the default scenario for that particular entity. Cool. So let's talk about the very first case. So the very first case that I was testing was 5 tiles. So you can see here, this is going to be transferring a total distance of 5 tiles. And the question was, do the chests matter? And how much worse is a car? You can't fit a tank in here, so that doesn't work. And a cargo wagon doesn't really work either for this. So the question, and you shouldn't use a cargo wagon for this anyway, and the space is way too big. So like these are like the most logical ones that you could use. Let's test them. So there's going to be wood, an iron chest, a steel chest, a legendary steel chest, and a car. So here you can see the average whole update time distribution, and you can see that same exact trend that we had before with like the 9,000 benchmarks that were run. You're getting, again, kind of a distribution of like wood happens to be better. In this case, the wood chest that was limited was better than the one that was a regular wood chest. But with the large run that we had before, that didn't seem to have any difference. And because they're so close in their differences, I don't think it really matters. But it's interesting. Let's go and look at this. So here's all the different chests. It seems like the chest type is almost no difference, or at least nothing that really mattered in terms of this very first test here. So the chest type doesn't seem to have any impact. Again, just the only thing was the legendary steel chest seemed to be the only outlier that was like, okay, this might be a thing. But the rest of them, because their inventories are so small, seemed like it just didn't make enough of a difference for you to even care. Now, what's interesting is looking at the car being disabled here is the first one where it's like, okay, this is obviously worse, but it's close. It's not that bad compared to this particular case here, where you're just using like the regular, like one steel, like kind of a steel chest in between. So just to explain this again here. So just having an extra one. So it's the same number of inserters everywhere. The only difference here is the medium in which we're transferring. What I found also interesting here is the order in which you wind up putting the items. So talking about just specifically cars here, the order in which you filter things matters. So, and we'll see that with the rest of the examples below, that same exact pattern and that trend continues to exist. But if you filter it to be the first slot, that happens to be the best case. And actually, if you're filtering it with the chosen target item, so you're not leaving it blank, that's almost as good as the default case where you're leaving all the slots open. Now, the moment that you don't select one, it seems like now this inventory size matters for cars, and it will have to scan the entirety of the car. So that seemed like an interesting one. Now here, I've just, for the representation purposes, I've left one case where you have the car enabled here versus it being disabled. And you can see how big of an impact it has if the car is drivable or not. So for me, I'm always going to run that script that I said in the beginning if I'm going to be using cars in my Megabase so that I can disable them and get that free entity update time for like zero cost other than running a script. I think there's actually some mods that exist out now that you can just use just to have it always disable all cars. So I'll probably even start using those mods. Otherwise, again, just to highlight here, if you look at like the differences here in terms of the overall entity update time associated with the cars when depending on where they happen to be filtering the items in. If it's the very first slot, the total entity update time, especially if it's filtered, was 2020 microseconds. The moment that you went to the last slot, there's almost twice the entity update time. So it's interesting to me because intuitively I thought that this would be like a hash map or a map of this item to this item, and like the filters would be maybe cached for the actual inventory once you could set them. But it seems like that's not the case. Otherwise, we would have seen that the car, it wouldn't have mattered the order as long as you actually selected the coin slot. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about this. Like if this was here versus down here, that shouldn't matter if it's a map, because it would know exactly which one it is already beforehand for the inserter. But since it's not doing that, it seems like it still has to scan the whole thing. And there's some optimization that exists if you happen to select the filter versus leaving it completely empty, like in this case here. So that was an interesting one. So the lessons learned out of this is that the chest container size, unless it's a legendary, just doesn't matter. Disabling cars is actually a close second to any chest, so using them, it can be really useful, especially if you have to cover a larger distance, which we'll show in the 7-tile case. Setting the filters on the slots is better than leaving it unset. That was something I didn't know when I first went into this. So just leaving it open, it has a higher cost for some reason. So, and then order matters. So as an example, if you're using like this for green circuit production, the first slot should be copper wires because that's going to be accessed the most often. Then maybe the second slot should be iron because that's, a third of the actual amount that you're going to be using it and running items through that. So if you're using a chest for those cases. The second case here now is, where was I going to go? Was the 7-tile case. So now we're adding the very first time an extra inserter into the mix, right? So now we can start using the larger chest types. So we can use a tank for this and we can use cars for this. So this test is now focusing on, if a larger chest is better than having an extra inserter to transfer items over a 7-tile distance. So here are the results for that. We have a very obvious drop off when we're using tanks here, but it gets interesting once we start filtering items. So I want to kind of talk through that. So here are the results for that. The best item, actually, by a resounding amount, was the case where you're either having the very first slot filtered to be a coin, or the car itself is just fully disabled and the entire inventory is free. That's an interesting thing to look at because that actually means that cars are cheaper than adding an extra inserter. And that makes sense when we looked at the very first benchmarks that we just looked at with the 5-tile case, because cars were so close already. So now if you go and disable the cars, you can see that they're almost as expensive as having that extra inserter. Now, what was interesting in this case is this is the first case where we could actually see that, okay, like limiting the actual slots kind of seems to matter a little bit more in this particular case, where it's constantly going in and out and in and out of the actual inventory. It didn't, for whatever reason, it did not matter if they happen to be limited or not. We did not see a net difference when it looked like this scenario, but for some reason, when we did the actual test over here with the 7-tile case, where both of these were limited, that's where we saw the bigger net improvement. So it seems like limiting the slots can be useful, but more so, again, the chest type seems to not matter at all. Now, the tanks, this is the big portion that I wanted to talk through. So I mentioned before that tanks have an electric network update time, and you can see that here. That's this electric heat fluid circuit update time. That's a multi-threaded component. But because of, now, take this with a grain of salt, right? You're not going to have this many tanks in your actual save file. You know, you're not going to have that many copies as I have here. But just to showcase something, that tanks are probably the last resort if you need to have a very large item. Using them in moderation is probably fine, but I'm just saying that for them themselves, they don't have a very high entity update time. And in fact, in terms of entity update time, they're better than adding an extra inserter. So they're good in moderation. Like, use a tank occasionally, like that's totally fine. But if you have thousands of tanks, even if you disable them, because of the electric network update time, they're just not worth it. If you have lots and lots of them. And that makes sense because you're adding for every tank an extra electric network. And what we already know too is that having less electric networks in general, like having one giant electric network on Novice or on Vulcanus or whatever planet you're on, is going to be overall just better to have. So because there's a limit of how many threads you're going to actually have on your computer. So if you have like 1,000 tanks, you know, you don't have 1,000 threads on your machine unless you have some like hyper computer that I don't know about. But you're not going to have that many individual cores and threads to run all the different ones. So you start sharing them, and then it starts hurting your overall electric network update time too. So that's a cost. So anyway, so that where I'm saying is like tanks can become more competitive if you happen to disable them. So yeah, so tanks can become more competitive if they're disabled. So then that removes the amount of entity update time that they have. But also the way that you filter them matters, just like cars. So if the first slot happens to be actually the chosen type that you're transferring through it, you can see that the entity update time drops substantially. So again, the same kind of pattern emerges. The order in which you do them matters. So in this case, a car that's filtered for the last slot being empty actually can be worse than tanks themselves. Yeah, it's because of the sheer high entity update time from a car just having a larger inventory. And then again, just the same exact thing happens for tanks, where a tank that happens to have the last slot being empty, and also it versus the first slot being empty, is going to be also just worse for the last slot. So the order again matters. So that again, that same pattern emerged here. So seeming like that's giving us more confidence that this makes sense. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting, because this is the 9-tile experiment. The unique property about trains or cargo wagons is that they can be both limited and they can also be filtered. So you have a choice now for the first time in terms of which one you're going to use, because they can use both patterns for chesting. So it's funny that actually like individual chests themselves only support limiting. They don't support filtered slots. And then like tanks can only be filtered and cars can only be filtered, but they can't be limited. And then a cargo wagon can do both. And that kind of makes sense because cargo wagons interact in a lot of different ways, and a lot of different ways you can use them traditionally with trains. So it makes sense they would use them. But anyway, this is a nice use case because now we can compare filtering versus limiting if you happen to have one or the other. So let's go through that here. So here's again that run distribution, and we can start seeing them. So this is the first time we start seeing train update time being associated with it. Train is just a breakout from entities, so it's nice because you can see them in comparison by themselves. But again, whenever you're using a cargo wagon to insert items in and out of it, like we have here, you're going to have train update time associated with it, right? Cool. So what we're seeing here is that actually limiting the amount of slots or having the wagon being in the default case was about the same. There didn't seem to be a huge difference between these two. In this particular run, we got an entity or a train update time of 539, 536, and 232 was the total entity update time. It was slightly better, but this is a 0.54% difference. So I'm calling them exactly the same. That's not enough to rule out a difference between the two. So it seemed like it didn't make a difference for wagons. Now, what did matter was filtering. So immediately what we can see is that like the filtered case here, this being 2.7% worse than the very first one, that's enough to actually say that might be an outlier here. So it seems like it's slightly worse. Not a huge difference. We're talking 2%, but still something. So if you look at it, if this being filtered and the first item being the actual coin, I also did the same case where I said I limited it and I set a filter just to test that. So it seems like the moment that you just literally set a filter at all, it's worse. I don't know why it is, but it is. So it's interesting that like this case here and this case are exactly the same. We've limited the inventory. The only difference is we're not filtering anything on this one. So it seems like just setting a filter, it has a cost associated with it. Now, then we see that same pattern. If we have all the slots filtered to something that we shouldn't be inserting into, but the first one is left empty, so there's no filter set, that's without a doubt worse. Same thing we saw on trains, on tanks and in cars. Now, if the last one happens to be filtered and it happens to be selected as a coin and is actually selected that way, that's also still worse. So, and if it happens to be empty, then it's even a little bit more worse than that. But all these cases are better than using 3 inserters to cover that distance. So it seems like using that this scenario here on the right is better than the one on the left. But you have to keep in mind, again, order matters for the inventory slots. So it's nice to see that same exact trend emerge. It's the same exact thing. It seems like it's all the same. Now, finally, the very last test that I did is I wanted one that's more real. So you're transferring green circuits. So in this case, I'm limited because I'm using wooden chests here to 3,200 electronic circuits. So for these tests, it's only 1,601 ticks compared to the ones in the past. What's cool about this is that now you can see what happens when you start filling up a chest over time. Does that make any difference? And this is the case that typically with clocking you're going to get into, where you're going to have a back pressure of items. So for this one is the first time I'm going to have a slightly different example. But again, we have all the same steel chests. We're doing the exact same test that we had before. We're covering a 5-tile distance, but now we have what I'm calling a back pressure test. So that would be the scenario where you output block the item that you're going to be inserting this into. So let's say the green circuits would be inserting into a red circuit production facility. And you stop the build for a while. The green circuits keep running until the chests fill up. Cool, they're done. So in this particular case, what I wanted to test out was, again, do we have the same level of there's no difference between the individual types of, if it's steel, wood, iron, same thing happened again. There doesn't seem to be any noticeable difference between these. So I'm getting more confident. We're getting again a pattern where using a larger chest, now like using a steel chest that happens to be legendary is worse. But here's an outlier that made no sense. Why is the steel, the normal quality steel, worse than the legendary quality? And if you happen to look at the runs here, well, there just happened to be that there was a slightly worse run, ever so slightly, that drew it out. I don't think there's a difference. Like I'm not seeing a net difference anywhere that's outside the standard distribution that even matters. So again, I don't think that the using a wood chest is worth it. Caring about if it's a legendary steel chest is worth it. I just don't think any of that stuff matters, and you should not focus on it. It makes no representative difference. Anyway, so I think I've nailed that over and over and over again. I think it's a myth. That's what I'm concluding at this point. Now, what's interesting next is we get into cars. Now, cars performed worse just like they did before, but it was interesting to me that now the cars themselves, they wind up getting, it seems like here, and let's talk about the cars themselves. There is, overall, we are not talking about 0.37% differences. We're now talking in the range of like over 1% difference. So this might be plausible that if a car is full, it might be just as good as if it happens to be completely empty, or it has just one slot being occupied, or if you're filtering that for the first item to be the actual target that you want to put in it. In this case, electronic circuits. So adding filters seems to again be the case where it shows that, okay, it's slightly worse to do it. But the big difference here that I want to point out is there's a very obvious, again, trend that shows up the third time we're doing this. So if you do not select, in this case, the car to have just to be blank for the very first slot. If you do that. So again, just to highlight that case, I'll scroll to the top here. If you create this scenario where you have nothing included in it, that's worse. Even in the case where you happen to have it constantly filled with green circuits, it's just worse. Why? I have no idea, but it's worse. So just a simple optimization is just already, if you're using filters, just put the target item that you want. In this case, is electronic circuits. Just do it. That's going to be just better. That's, again, just proving this itself the case again if we come back here and look at our results. So again, here you can see again the trend where you happen to be putting and inserting the items into the last slot. That's also worse. So again, order matters. It's the same thing. But even if the items are constantly in these tests, and I'll actually showcase this as we close out, I'll showcase what that test looks like. But you're seeing even if the items are actually occupied, physically sitting inside the chest, if you don't have the actual filter set, it's going to be worse. So let's go over to Factorio and I'll showcase that, and then I'll kind of close out with some of my thoughts on this. So here's this example that I was trying to showcase. This particular case here is worse than if I wound up just middle clicking on this and setting the filters. Surprisingly. So if you run this actual test here, you're seeing that this is running, inserting items in and out of it. This is constantly, throughout the whole test, always constantly having electronic circuits inside of it. It's interesting to me that the moment that you wind up, and we'll even look at this here if I press the F5 here, we can see like our update time is floating in the 4.5, 4.6 milliseconds, right? Let's go and showcase the one where it's actually set. This is the case where we've actually pre-selected it. And let's go ahead and run that. Now we're running at about 4 milliseconds of update time. The benchmarks showcase that, but I'm just highlighting it again. That simply the fact of just selecting this mattered. And it's also worse if it happens to be the last slot. So I'll showcase that then here. So the last being empty. So nothing selected. Go ahead and run it. Now we're hovering in the 5 milliseconds of update time. Same exact test. And then I'll showcase the one where the last happens to be... Do I have one where the last one is selected? Yes, I do. Fantastic. Here it is. We'll run it. And this one's better. It's a 4.8. So where I'm going with this and why I wanted to even talk about this is that their cars are a extremely competitive item that you can use in place of a chest, and they can be better than using an extra inserter. The filtering and how you filter them matters. So the takeaway that I would have from this video is, if you're going to do something like this, is that this slot is your highest throughput item. This would be your second highest throughput, third highest throughput, fourth highest throughput, and so forth. And that's a useful thing to know if you happen to be setting filters and if you have to use it. There's no real difference if you happen to let the whole thing fill up and have no filters set, but the moment you add filters, you got to be careful about which order you're putting them in. Now, this is all relevant for 2.0.72, which is the current version that I'm running. I'm sure the devs could make an optimization of this, so this may be invalidated in the future. So always check the version notes from this version on if you are curious about that. But as of right now, in the latest beta version of Factorio, this still matters. So then again, too, tanks are useful and they're a wonderful thing that you can wind up using, but just be careful with how many you add because of the electric network update time that they're going to cost. So that's just a thing that you need to kind of be aware of. But now, am I saying you should just abuse cars and put them everywhere and in every single case? No. But if you need to span a large gap and you need to use cars, they can be really good. So don't skip out on cars. They can do some pretty cool things for you, especially in the mega basing terms. So now, again, you just have to always make sure that you are running this command here to disable them. So if you don't like that and you don't like that playstyle, then ignore cars and just use chests. But if you're like me and you want to squeeze out as much EPS as you possibly can and reduce as much entity update time, this is, for me, a purely graphic option. There's no way that I'm going to grab my character and drive off in the car that happens to be being used as the chest. Like, I don't care about that. Yeah, it does disable achievements, but if you already have all the achievements, I don't know why you would care. So that's my thoughts on it. Those are my conductions. This is my experiment. So hopefully you find this stuff useful. I spent a lot of time on this. So if you appreciate this kind of stuff, definitely give the video a like or drop a comment below. And if you think that I've earned your subscription, I would love for you to consider subscribing to the channel. Other than that, thank you so much for watching. This has been a deep dive into chesting, and hopefully it helps you in your UPS explorations and in mega basing. Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ed Bucknasty. Have a fantastic rest of your day.